Venu, just checking if I'm audible.
Anand, you're audible, Anand.
Thank you.
So we will just start in a minute. Request all the panelists to switch on their video. We'll be just starting anytime soon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Venugopal Motkur, who will be the moderator for session today. The session we're going to talk about today is use of emerging data and techniques for evidence generation. Before we formally begin the conference, I would like to emphasize certain housekeeping rules. First, I would request that panelists be on mute at all times, except when they want to respond to the moderator questions. And secondly, the moderators, the panelists can respond to the questions posed by the attendees in the WebEx chat box. Third, audience are requested to post their questions in the Q&A chat box of the WebEx platform. If any of the questions remain unanswered due to the time constraints, we will hopefully be able to send individual replies to these audience members. So hopefully post your questions with your email IDs. And we also encourage audience to post your feedback on Twitter under the hashtag IndiaMELConf. So these details will be made available in the WebEx chat box. Hope you can leverage these details to post your feedback and comments. And we're looking forward to your active engagement in this conference session. Before I introduce the panelists who are gathered here with us today, I would like to set the agenda for this session. First, when we talk about monitoring systems today, right? Traditionally, monitoring emphasis is all on use of administrative data MI systems, but often independent researchers often view administrative MI systems with a lot of doubt. There's a lot of mistrust between the data quality on the data that is generated by the administrative governments, either at the central level or the state level or in the federal structure across the globe. When it comes to on the evaluation side, right, often there is reliance on survey data, but the collection of survey data is not costing time, but it's also very costly in terms of money. So both these critical constraints push us to explore if there is any other forms of data or techniques which we can leverage today. Why there is a need for for newer data or newer techniques is primarily because we are living in a very uncertain time today, especially as we have seen during the COVID. We want to make strategic decisions on a day-to-day basis. Where do I mobilize my health personnel? Where do I mobilize my food ration? Right? These are the decisions that are made on a day-to-day basis. So such a day-to-day strategic decisions makes us more important to see what are the other data platforms or newer forms of data that we can leverage for evidence evidence-based policy prescriptions, evidence-based policy evaluations, or evidence-based policy choices. So data also, when you talk about conventionally, when we talk about data, we're only looking at the data in the form of text, either be it collected from the structured interview process or through surveys or some in quantitative format. But today, when we talk about data, right? Data, we can talk about spatial data being the form of shape files coming from the GIS data collection from GIS tools, or we are looking at Facebook comments, tweets on Twitter. We are looking at videos, which is also a form of data. There is a lot of data that is generated today. A recent report by IBM says that a lot of data that exists today is in fact is generated just within last 2 years, right? And just to take an example, right, 3 million autonomous cars can generate a data almost equivalent of the 7 billion human population, right? So that's the kind of volume of the data that is generated today. So when we talk about this new form of data, what is this new form of data, right? So it's a variety, as I keep emphasizing, different forms of data, the velocity at which data is generated, the frequency, the number of people who are using smartphone, right? And the number of people who are using the digital tools, making living digital trials. So that's the variety of data that we are living, that we are generating. And also the variety and the volume, and the last one is the velocity. So all these constitutes the new forms of data. But how is this data also pushing towards adoption of new techniques, right? So we also seeing emergence of newer techniques such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, through which we can embrace these new forms of data and bring insights from the data, right? Data as such, there is a lot of data that exists in the platform, in the ecosystem today, but translating this data into the useful insights, either be it in the private sector or be it in the public sector, is the necessity of techniques. So how is this data translated into a monitorable indicators when it comes to public finance or public policy programs? So this is what we are going to discuss about our panelists here today. Our panelists here gathered here today comes from a variety of background. So without wasting much of our time, I'm going to quickly introduce you to the panelists today here. And thereafter, we're going to jump into the opening remarks from each of the panelists, followed by a moderator session of around 20 minutes, and ending with probably the questions from the audience and the closing remarks from each of the panel members. So that's going to be the agenda for today. So I'm going to start quickly with introducing the panelists who are here today. First, we have Sri Ganesh. Sri Ganesh is with UN Pulse Lab Jakarta. Sri Ganesh is an alumnus of MIT and NUS, and is going to bring the perspective of how multilateral organizations like UN Pulse Lab are increasingly embracing these newer forms of data and techniques, especially by working with the national governments, and also understand what are the challenges faced in adoption of such techniques and contribute towards the greater public good. The second speaker, what we have today, is Purnima Dore. Purnima Dore is the head of data-driven governance at Tata Trust. Purnima is an alumnus of Lady Shriram College, XLRI, and IIT Bombay, and is going to bring the perspective of micro-planning frameworks, capacity of government personnel, especially at the local body level, and the need for localization of SDG goals. Our third panelist, Anand Trivedi from DMU Niti Ayog. Anand, an alumnus of MDI Gurgaon, is going to bring a perspective of how central and state governments are embracing emerging technologies. Our fourth panelist, Sayak from 3IE, an alumnus of University of Calcutta and Portland State University, is going to talk about an interesting paper that he has written along with few of his co-authors on the use of evidence, on the use of big data across the globe by looking at a time period of 2005 to 2019. The last panelist, Bharat Pandey from Omidyar Network, an alumnus of Harvard Kennedy School, University of Cambridge, and St. Stephen's, is going to bring in a perspective of how, an investor perspective of how emerging technologies are embraced by the social impact organizations, and how Omidyar Network is playing a vital role in building the capacities, not just at the government as well as among the non-government bodies, to create social impact. So without much further ado, I will request that our panelists to make opening remarks. So we'll start first with Sri Ganesh and hopefully move to Purnima, Anand, Sayak, and Bharat in the same order. So we'll start with Sri Ganesh. Sri Ganesh, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So just briefly, Pulse Lab Jakarta is a joint initiative of the United Nations and the government of Indonesia, and part of the UN Global Pulse Network, which sits under the Secretary General's office. So for my introductory remarks, I just want to touch on two things, a couple of things, starting with an example. So what you see there is a solution that we were part of developing in the last year for the West Java provincial government. And in some ways, I hope this will preempt some of the questions that may come in the Q&A, which is that when we are dealing with new forms of data, these aren't really a replacement for the existing traditional data. So in this case, what we were trying to do was to help inform policymakers in the provincial government about understanding both the ground situation in terms of the case incidents, as well as trying to predict how it may spread and identify high-risk areas for the government. So a key part of this was really overlaying different data sets, traditional data, as well as new forms of data, including, Waze traffic data is an imperfect measure of mobility, but we sort of used this as a proxy to understand congestion, as a proxy to understand the level of mobility on public transport infrastructure. So the idea here is really to try and effectively bring existing administrative data as well as new forms of data into decision-making systems that have been adapted to the kinds of decisions that people on the ground and decision makers on the ground have to make. Next slide, please. So really, when we talk about these, there are a plethora of examples, not just from our organization, but from many others. If you're trying to think about how do you try and mainstream this, in some ways, COVID-19 presents an opportunity because, let no crisis go to waste in terms of trying to mainstream some of these uses, especially when you don't have very high frequency data available through the traditional means. So if you're trying to mainstream, I would sort of just touch on three things. One is, if you're thinking about the pathway to trying and mainstreaming this in government, there's all this talk about, first trying to raise awareness about how this works. But the next step is one of the critical ones, which is how do you make government decision makers informed and discerning consumers, right? That goes beyond just basic awareness so that they are able to ask critical questions to assess the validity and quality of these kind of what the insights that are developed through here, right? And there are some things that are relevant to be able to do that, right? The second is really sustainable data partnerships, because as in relevant to the monitoring and evaluation space as well, often you start with the idea that you have complete control over the data creation process. As soon as you start leveraging data from other parties created for a lot of other purposes other than what it was intended to, you no longer control and understand how the data was collected. So having that strong linkage in terms of your data partnerships with others is critical, mainly to ensure that these are not one-off instances of data sharing, but rather replicable and sustainable data partnerships. And there are several things that would need to be solved to be able to get to that particular place. Third is capacity development, broadly speaking, and I know one always starts with the idea that you bring in more data scientists and you solve the problem. That is not just it. It's not a question of really just having data scientists. A lot of this is emergent science, so critical thinkers are hugely important, especially interlocutors who can articulate problems from different domains and sort of do the translation work that may be required, but also in terms of design specialists, etc., for decision support systems, right? And one of the ways to sort of doing this is through very targeted analytical partnerships that need to be done. So you start to learn by doing. So I'll stop here and leave this as my sort of introductory comments. Over to you.
Thank you, Ganesh. Over to you, Podimaji.
Hello and good afternoon. I think it's some of the things that I think are important when we are looking at this journey of using technology, using data for better decision making. I feel that the devil is really in getting the granularity right. As Shri Ganesh also rightly pointed out, that one is, of course, building that awareness where people know what to do, but how to do it. I think most people today are grappling with the big how questions. And I'd like to share some, very quick experiences across three of these dimensions, drawing from some of our experiences on the ground. So at the Tata Trust, I look at data-driven governance. And this is something that has evolved in the last 4 or 5 years, where we as a philanthropy do work across different domains. But the fact that data and information can be this undercutting thing which helps you take decisions and which also helps stakeholders in the ecosystem take decisions. So how does an MP decide which are those core activities that the MP Lads Fund can be used for? How does the DC decide, which are those priority big bucket items that my budgets have to help me with? So this choice of budgeting planning, I think it works right from the union budget to what needs to happen at the granular level. And most of our decision makers at each level, I think, face these challenges about, is my data also telling me or helping me in the choices I need to make? So some things that, we've tried to do, one is to look at how data can be used for micro planning. So where the bottom up planning factors in today's new tech developments and how do we make that reach the field. So we've tested out a framework and developed in-house a framework called Delta, which is data evaluation, learning, technology, and analysis. And this is something we actually figured out over the last 4 years. We started with, surveys and local area development plans, and then realized that if technology can help us so much today, then what are those ways we can engage with it? So to give you a quick flavor, we've tried to look at how household level data collection using tablets, using some of these tools can be done with people from the field itself. So how do you train up people who are 7th standard, 8th standard pass, who are from the village itself, to use some of these survey tools to capture ground up information? And that then has information at a household level about incidents, disease incidents, about hygiene factors, about education attributes, livelihood choices at the household level, map that with institutional parameters. What's happening at the Anganwadi? What is happening in the school? What is happening at the PHC? What are those indicators telling us? And using that together to paint a picture of the village and identify, partner that with PRA tools. So we've tried to use technology-enabled surveys along with participatory rural appraisal to arrive at a requirement shelf of these are the priorities of the village. This is the kind of budget available at the panchayat level under 1340 Finance Commission. Now local resources are available. And so how do you use that to make a plan? So we've tried this at scale, partnered with some of the district administrations around this. And one of the interesting features that I'm seeing happen is that Maharashtra government picked this up for their village social transformation program. We used some elements of this in our partnership with Niti Aayog under the aspirational districts program, where the idea has been, and Mr. Kant has been very serious about looking at, how do you look at district level performance and ground up parameters. So the thing data should be able to help us to do is to aid responsive and need-based planning. Moving to the next slide, if we were to also tie this up with the SDG story. So ground up data, being able to talk to the internationally acceptable frameworks. This is something we've started doing. It's not something we've done at scale, but if you have granular information, there is this tremendous potential to map this. And we've started working on our own data collection tools to map them with SDG indicators in the back end, so that any cut that you want ideally should be available to you. We had a pilot which was actually in the offing in partnership with the NITI team led by Sanjukta Samadhar, with the UNDP led by Shoko Noda, as well as the MOSPI team. And all three of them have been working on SDG localization. But with COVID, we were not able to go that route. But the fact that these linkages are possible is something that I think in these conversations about, how do you make it granular? I think it makes sense to connect with the various frameworks which are being developed centrally and look at the granular data and its structure so that it can talk to them and you can pull out whatever cut you need. So getting greater, yeah. So with that, I think I'll just quickly move to my final slide where I will just spend half a minute, which is connected with this point about capacity building. I think we also see capacity building as a very critical part. We've tried to do that on the urban side with Mahua in one of our partnerships, where we've developed a course curriculum called Delta ACE, which looks at how basics of data governance can be internalized for the local decision maker. And I'm happy to touch upon these type of tools later as we go along. But I think granularity, being able to have the ability of the data structures to talk to larger frameworks, and capacity building of the lowest stakeholder, I won't say lowest, the most closest to the field, that kind of stakeholder with data are three very important pegs in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Purnimaji. Thank you very much. Anand, if before I come back to you, I think there are three important points which Sri Ganesh and Purnima has emphasized, and probably can build on your opening remarks based on this. As Sri Ganesh emphasizes three important points, which I think, which at DMU we are already working on. One is awareness. Second point, partnerships. Third, capacity building. And fourth, which Purnima is bringing, granularity. I think these are the four different facets which DMU is already tackling. So probably you want to build on these 4 points and want to expand your opening remarks building on
Absolutely.
these remarks. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
absolutely. Thank you, Venu. So, to build on these specific elements here, as you rightly pointed out that Sri Ganesh and Purnima talked about, there are two broad areas in which DMU and Niti Aayog is already thinking about these aspects. And from a government and an Apex M&E office perspective, it's important to also follow up on this. And that's where I think these two elements are to be able to understand what innovations and emerging approaches are being adopted on the ground at the district or at the state levels, as rightly pointed out by Purnima ji, in its various forms, to be able to mainstream the process. So it's one thing to have innovative projects around, but it's the other to have a systematic approach to actually collect these innovations and build broader policy frameworks around it so that it becomes a sustainable practice. That's one. And the second is, how do you also benchmark what is happening on the ground and enable the people to self-assess their own innovations so that eventually they also improve on the pathway. So the slide here basically talks about, we know that there are a number of innovations which are happening in decentralized manner using various technologies. And in the area of M&E, we talk about basic steps like data generation, subsequently exchange and use and dissemination. We know that in the government of Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, they're using drones extensively for various kinds of infrastructure project monitoring exercises. Remote sensing is being extensively used for various area-based interventions monitoring. IoT is being now implemented in the Jal Jeevan mission, for that matter, for enabling the quality and quantity of the water supplies and the service deliveries. Once this data is now available, there are a number of initiatives even at the central government to enable what we call the big open link data, which is essentially data exchanges in the form of the National Data Analytics Portal, or for that matter, the National Information Infrastructure Platform, which is being worked upon by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. And once this data is available, as Sri Ganesh rightly pointed out, we have to enable the government functionaries to essentially become the consumers and effective users of this information. And that's where we are also seeing a lot of innovations which are happening in the form of real-time dashboards, the CM dashboards for Andhra Pradesh or Gujarat, for that matter, that we already know about. What is essential is, once these innovations are in place in their own decentralized manners, we have to have a systemic way in which we decontextualize it, build the systemic capacities, and then put in place the necessary policy measures, including the adherence to the regulatory frameworks, so that they become scalable. So DMU is extensively working in this area, and we are looking forward to working with partners going forward to enable this process on the one hand. On the second hand, coming to the next slide, we have also come up with a benchmarking process for enabling how this data is being used and how it is being generated and how technology is being used in the monitoring elements of these programs. So we have come out with a data governance quality index toolkit, and this toolkit essentially enables governments at various levels, state, central, and others, to use a systemic way to assess their own data maturity levels in terms of how they're using technology in generation, quality assessments, and use, and put a reflective idea on it so that they are able to improve in a inorganic manner and see exponential growth as far as the data use is concerned. So with those two broad elements, on one side, we enable through the cooperative federalism's sort of intervention, and through the other, we enable benchmarking at the ground level, which can enable them to improve themselves inorganically. So those are the broad two themes on which DMU is extensively working on, and I'll be happy to elaborate on it when we come to the next steps.
Thank you very much, Anand. Thank you very much. I think we've talked about in terms of opportunities that have been created by these new forms of data. Saik, I think your research paper predominantly is going to talk about What is the evidence that is coming from the use of these technologies across the globe? Over to you, Saik.
Right. Thank you, Venu. So what we are seeing right now is the collision of two fields, right? Data science, which has grown dramatically in the recent years, and impact evaluation. So about a year and a half ago, we at 3IE kind of were grappling with this question of how what's going on in this field right now. This is a new intersection that we are seeing, right? So what we decided to do is to kind of look at the state of play. And so what we did was we went back and systematically searched the literature to see, to look for studies that have used big data to measure, monitor, and evaluate development outcomes. And by development outcomes, what we mean is basically SDGs. So we have grouped some of the SDGs together as well. But basically, the overview of the map that you can see on your screens right now kind of points out to what are the big data sources that are being used, and then on one side you have the development outcomes, and on the other side you have the type of studies that are being studied. So what we see from here is that there is a lot of studies being done with machine generated data. So by machine generated data, what I mean is data generated from mostly satellites, and then we see not a lot of data from, say, process mediated or human sourced. And so these are data that is being generated by crowdsourcing, social media, your Facebook, Twitter, then your administrative data, your call detail records, and so on. Now, another important thing that we kind of found out is that there are these measurement studies which are actually measuring and monitoring different outcomes, and not necessarily evaluating something, which are actually being done in a large scale across the globe. And so these are studies which sort of can be talked about as proof of concept of these methods and these data sources that are being used. And that can be probably in the future, which the map kind of says is a gap, is where you can use them in the impact evaluation space. As you can see in the map, in the figure, the number of impact evaluations is not that much, right? So can we go to the next slide, please? So one of the trends that we kind of saw, we kind of plotted the number of studies using different kinds of data sources over time, and we saw that over time the satellite data has been the most used, right? In the previous slide also I mentioned kind of that being the most popular one. But when we look at the trends, we see that over time this has grown more and more in prominence. So one of the studies that we had funded was to look at the long-term impact of the Konkan Railway. So this looked at the economic, the environmental, environmental impacts and the economic impacts. So in this study, what the authors did was that they merged census data with your satellite data to understand and do an evaluation, right? A retrospective evaluation. So what they did, they looked at the satellite data from 1991 and 2001 and 2011. So the Konkan Railway was built between 1991 and 1998. And so what they found was that the green cover, so they looked at the green cover. So I'll just talk about one of the outcomes. The green cover actually degraded while the Konkan Railway was built, but over time it actually got back and it was better in the last half. So these kind of things are not really possible using your traditional data sources, right? So if you had to do something like this with going out there and talking to people or asking questions to people head on, it is not sort of possible to see long-term impacts that easily. So this is one example. And as I mentioned, right, 70% of the measurement studies and about 80% of the impact evaluations use data from satellites, and especially luminosity data, data imagery, etc. Can we go to the next slide, please? Lastly, I want to talk about the geographical distribution of the study. So basically to understand the global distribution of the studies that are being done so far, right? So studies which use big data to measure, monitor, and evaluate development outcomes. We see that US, India, and China are three countries where most number of studies have taken place. We see that East Africa has been studied as well, but not all of Africa, right? So there are gaps where, or there are areas where studies are still not being done. And so this map sort of, so the systematic map, the literature review that we did, kind of points to different gaps in areas where you can also, in future, kind of think of like, like do studies or something like that. So going forward, like what does this all mean together? Like the three things that I showed, like the overview of the map, the trends, and then the geographical distribution, right? So this kind of points to a huge gap in the impact evaluation space, right? So out of as far as out of like the 450 odd studies that we finally got for our paper, only about 10% of the studies were impact evaluations, right? So we have these measurement studies, which are kind of proof of concept for the methods and the data sources, which in the future, there's a huge potential to use these methods and data sources in impact evaluation and yeah, in impact evaluation. So lastly, I would say that, like big data creates opportunities for faster, cheaper, and in some cases, more robust impact evaluation, and that it also helps investigate topics, locations, and situations that are otherwise more difficult to study. And one example was the Konkan Railway one, and there are plenty of examples of conflict areas, difficult to reach areas, humanitarian crisis areas, and especially during a global pandemic like the coronavirus, right? So I'll stop there, and yeah.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks for those wonderful, insightful remarks. We kind of looked at opportunities, the case for opportunities, the existence of use cases from SAIC, especially when looking at the emerging form of data. We're going to now go to Varad to understand, Varad is part of the Omidyar network, and Varad kind of, being part of the Omidyar network, who fund a lot of these social impact organizations. So Varad, coming back to you, like what are the key metrics that the Omidyar network monitors and to ensure that these social impact organizations create the desired impact on the ground, and these social impact organizations are also embracing technology. So over to you, Varad.
Thanks, Venu, and firstly, thanks to DMEO for hosting this excellent event and really trying to mainstream this discussion, and also to my fellow panelists, all of whom are bringing, I think, very, very diverse and important perspectives to this topic. So firstly, just to step back, I think I wanted to make a couple of points. One was to say that this is a very timely discussion. I think as an investor, we are also seeing a lot of interest, especially after COVID-19, etc., on quote unquote impact investing. And therefore, I think it's a great tailwind for the monitoring, evaluation, and learning agenda, which I think is great. I think the first thing I wanted to say was that, very often before we jump into what technology or what tool to use and all of that stuff, it's very important to step back and think of measurement fit for purpose, right? So what is the objective of what we want to measure? What is the theory of change of the intervention? And what are your budget and time constraints, right? And to give you an example, as an investor, our goals are not, necessarily RCT level gold standard sort of results. Our goals are A, to get a sense of whether we are making progress in terms of contributing to the impact goals we have defined. And second, are our investees and grantees, can we help them do better in serving the customers and beneficiaries that they're working on, right? So that's sort of the frame. And I think it's very important for whoever the organization is to be very clear on the objective and then choose both the measurement framework and technology tools underlying it. I think tech has to be seen, therefore, as an enabler of that vision that you have for your measurement and evaluation, and of course, not as an end in itself. The other thing I wanted to say was, while there's a lot of energy and excitement around things like big data, things like machine learning, etc., and I think some of the other panelists have spoken about it, I do want to say there is a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of using existing sources of data and existing technology tools, which are not 5-10 years out in the future, but are there already. And let me give you two examples. One is just trying to leverage existing data sets and data streams. And I think one example was given earlier. But for example, the work that Neeti is doing with the National Data Analytics Platform, which we are sort of privileged to partner with you on a little bit. But the idea there that there's already a ton of quote unquote open data which exists. Is there a way to create a streamlined way of bringing it together, not just as a stock of data, but as a flow of data in an ongoing way, and making that happen? A similar initiative is being done by the Indian School of Business under something called the Digital ID Research Initiative, which is trying to find high frequency data sets which already exist and mining it on a weekly basis for some insights which will be useful for jobs, employment, growth, etc., etc. So I think the point that there is a low-hanging fruit here which we must harness. And secondly, I think there are also what I would call low-tech ways, low-tech but highly innovative ways of doing monitoring evaluation. And again, one example here is, every year we do something called a lean data survey, which is to get a dipstick sense of how are the end beneficiaries or customers of our investees and our grantees doing. And we have a framework where we measure both the direct impact on their lives, and we measure that by assessing, number one, the reach, which is the standard thing on how many people are they reaching, but also depth and inclusion. And we have over time created simple questions which can help answer that question on the depth of impact and on where in the income pyramid the average beneficiary or customer lies. So the direct impact we see as a combination of reach, depth, and inclusion. And then we also measure sector impact, which is beyond the impact on the direct beneficiaries. Is there systemic change which is happening through the grantee or investee? And we measure that again through three interesting metrics. One is we measure what we call imitators, which is have other organizations either replicated or adapted in some way the operating model, business model of our investee. The second is what we call capital crowded in, or capital. So after our funding went in, has the grantee investee been able to raise additional funding, and to what extent? Because it's a sign that the idea is getting more mainstreamed and getting more traction. And third, in terms of contribution to policy change. And we've created a framework of how to sort of measure that, but that is another way of seeing whether a grantee is making a difference. So I think thinking about a combination of direct impact and sector impact, breaking that into specific metrics which are fit for purpose for your organization, and then leveraging tools like lean data, which by the way costs us less than ₹1 per beneficiary to get a good handle of progress along these dimensions, is I think the way forward. I won't dwell on other things because many others have spoken on it, but I think maybe you can bring this into the discussion. I'd love to get the views of others also on this big question of sustaining capacity, culture, sustainable use of some of this stuff, because very often this is a discussion people like us who are very deeply embedded into the MEL and learning sector have, but really our challenge is to broaden and mainstream this discourse.
Right. Thanks, Bharat. Thanks for bringing that interesting insights and the Indian jugaad in the MEL systems. Especially like coming back and trying to put our thoughts together onto the table. Sri Ganesh brings in the perspective of the need for building awareness as a starting point, especially when it comes to these new data and new techniques, and also moving on to building the partnerships as we go ahead, and also bring in the granularity which Purnima ji brings in, and at the same time building and looking at the fit for purpose models, as you call it, and predominantly when we look at Saik's presentation, right, we looked at the adoption, especially on the impact evaluation side, on these emerging techniques or the emerging data continues to be low. So Saik, probably I'm going to come to you and probably move to Bharat. First, Saik, what is that factors that are hindering the adoption of these new data or techniques for evaluation purpose, especially because we have seen that even though the large extent of data is used for the measurement purpose, a lot of the impact evaluations which are basically summarized in the systematic study are probably doing at a very broad level of economic development, but the requirement, especially for the central and state governments, is probably at a policy and a program level. So probably what do we do to overcome, what are the obstacles that you see, that are these techniques or data that is available amenable for measuring the impact of policies and programs of not just the government of India, but looking across the globe? Over to you, Saik.
Yeah, so I mean there are a bunch of challenges that that creep up when you kind of think about using the different sources that have not used not been used a lot, right? So talking about like the call record details or talking about the Facebook and the Twitter data and all that, right? So one big question that or one big thing that impact evaluation kind of looks at is I mean, if you have exclusion, right? So these forms of data tend to exclude a population, right? So for example, you and I probably use Facebook, right, or Twitter, but not a person who is in some really remote area where maybe internet hasn't gone on, right? So when you think of using these sort of data sets to go in that granular level, it kind of actually unintentionally excludes these people, and so you won't find the actual impact of say a policy or a program. Now, saying that, say for example, the use of satellite data is so huge, right? So many studies are using satellite data. So using the satellite data, you probably are not going to go into that granularity level, but you can leverage satellite data with other forms of, say, cell phone data or something, and kind of bring in that sort of impact, right? That study that sort of impacts. For example, I'll just give you one example and stop there. So the study by Joshua Blumenstock at University of Berkeley in Rwanda, right? So he used cell phone data to kind of look at the wealth of people, right? He had to kind of use that, right? So just an example of that is like that could have been used, but you know, like um, so the example, what I was trying to say is that 70% of the people in Rwanda had cell phones at that moment. So that could have been used well, but this is not always possible. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thanks, Saik. Thanks. Before I move to Bharat, I probably want to bring Sri Ganesh here in. Sri Ganesh, I think Saik brings an interesting perspective of data poor, especially when it comes to the new forms of data. So how you at UN Pulse Lab overcome such gaps and what can be done, especially when we want to embrace these new techniques? Over to you, Sri Ganesh.
Okay, I mean, let me just start with the thing, even if it's data poor, whether you call it data poor, bias, it's sort of all sort of facets of the larger problem, right? Very rarely do you get a data set in whether it's traditional or new or that is not biased in some way. It's a slice of reality. So understanding what slice of reality or that it represents is point number one, right? Just because it represents a particular slice of reality doesn't make it useless. It just, having the awareness to at least then you can sort of come through some solution. And I'll talk briefly about that. But if you know what slice of reality it is capturing, you then try and find other ways to capture the reality that you don't, that are not captured here. So, but at the same time, one can say from a government policy perspective is what gets measured gets done, right? So I always think of this thought experiment that I utilize when talking about this is that, back in 2014, there was a application called Street Bump, which was developed by the Boston City Council. Idea being you put it in your car, you go around, it generates a signal saying that, you went over a pothole, right? So it's a resource allocation problem, nicely, neatly solved. You bring it to a country where you don't have sufficient penetration of smartphones. I mean, let's imagine we are in let's say 2015 and you're bringing it to Delhi, right? So you can ask some questions, wait, am I going to prioritize the roads that are read by the rich, right? But maybe not, because most roads are traversed by all, right? But maybe it might miss some areas, right? Maybe it might miss in Bombay the railway, right? Um, but you do have spatial maps, right? You can think of a solution where you initiate this application in that data poor environment, and you wait for the signals to come, and then you look for where are the signals not coming. So the lack of a signal is a signal too, and that's where you send your trucks to. So designing these kind of solutions to different forms of data that have gaps are possible, but first you need to know what slice of reality it is. Are the gaps going to be consistent the same next time you utilize the data, right? Or is it going to change? So there are these kind of questions that need to be answered, but there are possible pathways to ensuring coverage, right? But not always.
Thanks, Sri Ganesh. Thanks for this wonderful views. So Bharat, coming back to you, like we are now getting thoughts of like, we can measure impact through using these embracing these emerging forms of data or techniques. But, when it comes to measuring impact, often forgotten is that, impact is not immediate, probably not short term, but probably is a very long term. As an investee organization, so when you actually look at the social impact organization and what designing metrics for these impact organizations, how do you capture these, how do you access the outcomes, especially those at the long-term level? And how do you see that, especially when it comes to governments, which probably have an annual budgetary exercise through which the budgets are been allocated? How do governments can start adopting these outcome based measurements using these new forms of data? Any thoughts on this, Bharat?
Yeah, thanks. So let me tackle your long-term question first. So, part of what I was explaining to you earlier on, we measure direct impact and sector impact, right? And the sector impact is because of the reason that you explained, that it's not enough to say that, you reach so many 100,000 people. You also are looking for change at a more systemic level, right? So the very fact that you're measuring system level variables in every investment is one way to ensure that there is a long-term orientation and there are no perverse incentives and so on and so forth. Number one. Number two, I think it's very important, and I'm taking an investor lens, right, is to embed impact along the life cycle of one's investment. And what that really means in practice is that one, at the time of making the investment, there has to be a very important discussion on impact and what is our theory of change and impact and how exactly we'll measure it. Number one. During the course of the investment, there have to be regular discussions with the investee on progress, and renewals of funding have to be based on achievement of those impact metrics, which is something we do. And lastly, also, I think in exits, so exits is a very important thing for all investees and grant makers, is sort of setting up the organization for sustainability beyond your own funding. And that means having those discussions much before your funding is going to end, ensuring a sustainable financial base, but also being thoughtful about who else is going to pick up the pieces of the puzzle once you leave. We also do a lot of for-profit impact investing. So this is a very important question for us. Who do we sell the company to? And so when we have that discussion, it's not about only finding a buyer with the highest price for the asset, but equally, is it someone who is going to be committed to the impact potential that this organization has? This year, we are instituting something called exit impact assessments, which is actually looking closely at some of the organizations we are exiting and assessing, are we setting them up on a path to continued long-term sustainable impact? So I think those were two approaches, at least from an investor lens.
Thank you very much, Bharat. Coming back, Anand, probably the same question. What can government do in terms of adoption, especially of these emerging data or techniques, in measuring something, like India's commitment towards a sustainable development goals or national development agenda? Over to you, Anand.
Yeah, so taking cue from what Varad said and also what Sri Ganesh mentioned, it's extremely important. So there are two broad pathways that are extremely critical for embedding emerging technologies in the M&E of the programs. And one of the most important element is to embed the design, embed these emerging approaches right at the design stage. So whenever we have any new scheme or a program which is coming up for approvals, and we know we have been giving our inputs on that, it is extremely critical that what technological interventions are going to be planned has to be embedded into the design, and also it has to be very well weaved into the M&E plan of the scheme. So the most important element is every scheme has to think about it right at the design stage. Secondly, to build on what Sri Ganesh said, that it is important also that while all of these individual siloed programs, and mind well, in government we have about 600 such programs with their own individual MIS systems generating a lot of data, it is extremely critical that we have the right data exchange mechanisms. And for that, it is also very important that we come out with the right data sharing standards, at least within the government. And once that is in place, then we will be in a better position. Because even if we talk about the National Data Analytics Portal, I'm sure Varad would agree that the data schema and the data systems and even the technological platforms are so different that it becomes so difficult to actually think about an integrated system. So we have to get the nuts and bolts of these systems in place right at the design stage and at the data sharing standards mechanism. And I think the next step of enabling integrated use and cross agency prescriptive analytics can only follow. So I think that's the broad pathway.
Can I just add something to what Anand said, because you mentioned NDAP? So just a plus one on what you said. I think the main task in something like NDAP is actually to get that data schema right. And really the exciting thing of that whole initiative is not so much that they are going to bring together data sets, but they're going to create the standards that will withstand the test of time and become the default for government data exchange and so on. I think that's the most important thing. The other one on that, I think Anand is, and you'll probably have a view on this, is the taking a use case lens and not a data set lens, right? Which is to think of what problems are we solving? Let's, is it the problem? So what is the problem of a district collector we are trying to solve? How should I place my public health centers, for example? What's the problem of Ministry of Finance you're trying to solve? And taking that lens, as opposed to we are just a collector of data or data sets. I think those two are the key things to get right if you want things like NDAP to succeed.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks, Varad. Thanks, Anand. Coming back to Purnima, like picking on the thoughts left by Varad and Anand. So data standardization, especially, becomes a very critical point, especially when it comes to these new forms of data, right? There are varieties of data that have been generating today, apart from images, text, videos, tweets. So how do you see such data amenable to something like granularity of monitoring SDGs at local level? So do you see an opportunity for such data use, especially for something like smart city measurements or something like monitoring SDGs at a local level? Over to you, Purnima.
So I think that, of course, there is a tremendous opportunity, and the ability to do something with that is going to be in the data definitions, right? How well are we going to? So if we look at, there is numerical data, and not just in the newer forms. There are the standard data sets that are getting collected at the department level, at a city, or even at the district. And today the issue is that everybody has a different definition of what they collect. Even if you look at something like water, the way city A is collecting information around water between even say Gwalior and Surat, there will be a lot of difference in what they collect. Two is even departments within the city, the way they are defining it for similar purposes is different. And for a municipal commissioner to reconcile, we've seen issues where even population, different departments are capturing that particular indicator, and most projections and every planning is based on that, right? So I think it's very, very important. And as more and more data sets or data formats come in, looking at least the top few, and probably, some of the efforts you all are doing at DMEO and through the analytics portal are going to be important here, to get those to have a mandate to standardize some of these definitions, to socialize that in the ecosystem so that people are defining the same thing in the same way. Otherwise, the aggregation story, the prediction story, the use of AI, all of that is not going to happen because you are not having an apple to apple kind of a comparison. So even if one wanted to start with looking at core decision points, as Bharat was saying, what do you want to solve for? If there are some big points, top 100 points that we want to cover, 10 each for each core sector, and the definitions of that are kind of beaten down. There is some agreement on that, and that I know is a very tough one, but that I think is going to be extremely important if one wants different tools to follow that format, because today what's there in the system is not following that. So I would definitely vote for a centralized plan to put some of these definitions in place. It could be through a working group format, it could be through representation from departments. Niti and some of you all may be well placed to anchor some of that, but getting an agreed plan on data definitions is a good way to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for Purnima ji. I think one of the issue that probably I want to diverge a little and want to bring back the discussion. One of the key concern, especially when it comes to these emerging data or emerging techniques, is the consent part of it, right? Normally, when I go for a survey, normally we're asking the consent of the user and taking the consent and then collecting the data. But when it comes to this newer forms of data, especially data that is the data exhaust that we'll call it, data that is left through the digital data trials. And second risk that I probably want to see, I want to get the thoughts of all the panelists, is also the opportunity of re-identifying even the anonymized data sets. So how are we going to tackle the problems of data privacy, data security, especially when it comes to these newer forms of data? Probably I'll start with Purnima ji, and then probably we'll go to Sayak next.
Okay, I think that's the big question today. And I think Varad had recently written an interesting piece on it. So I'd love to hear what he also has to say on this. But I think consent has been abused a lot. And I think what we would probably need to think about, of course, one is looking forward to the Data Privacy Act getting formalized as soon as possible, so that all stakeholders have a clear roadmap on what they need to be doing to make it happen. But I think data privacy by design is something that, folks like us at the Trust, Omidyar, even from the government side, when we are making investments, or when we are writing up our vendor contracts, we should put in privacy by design and elements around that built into that. I have started doing some of that in my end, so that we are encouraging the technocrats also, and many of them want to think about it. It's just that if it's not a precondition for many things, sometimes it comes to a we'll think about it later kind of piece. But putting the onus of privacy by design into our MOUs, into our negotiated contracts, I think will help push the needle in that direction. Also, I think building up capacities a little more on privacy, on data security. I think we lack those capabilities sometimes, not just within government, but also in the private sector. And so leveraging academia, leveraging stakeholders who've done something about this to build that narrative. I'm part of a committee on AI with the World Economic Forum, and these are some of the things that we discussed there too, where the point Sriganesh made on partnerships coming in there, bringing in specialists to look at how to solve for this. I think globally, everybody is grappling with how to look at data privacy and policies around that. But getting the central policy right and building in privacy by design would be my two key thoughts on this.
Thank you very much. Saik, before I think Varad can pitch in.
Yeah, I totally agree with Purnima. So one big issue like with big data, the challenge is de-identification due to its sheer scale and volume, right? But a lot of the work that I do at 3IE, it surrounds not just big data, but data in general, and we look at ethics and transparency, reusability, reproducibility, and all that, right? So re-identification is a challenge. I mean, it is very difficult. What you can do is probably you can take a step back and kind of think of like putting in processes and protocols beforehand that could actually kind of you preempt certain areas where there can be data leakage, or you preempt that XYZ other data sets can be linked together to kind of re-identify the subject. And so you kind of try and mitigate those sort of things from what Purnima kind of said, like mitigating them beforehand, sort of a thing. But in the essence of like re-identification or de-identification of data, it is really difficult. Like from my work, I can totally tell you that like in general, like doing de-identification of normal data sets also presents a lot of challenges, and big data is another ball game altogether, right? So one thing I'll leave, maybe the other panelists can chime in as well. The idea of a thing called like a ethics review board, right? So we ask certain ethical questions beforehand about the data privacy, about data leakages and everything. And it's not just looking at an institutional review board, but more on the side of ethics and asking questions about human subjects participation in big data and other emerging tech. I'll stop there.
Right, Varad.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising this issue. First of all, I think as Purnima said, this is like the big issue of our times. And I think, first of all, just to say, I think we should all accept that consent is broken. I think that's a good starting point for this discussion. I think we all do lip service to consent. We all know what, we all also sign off on many things regularly. And to imagine that people who have lesser technical literacy are able to make sense of consent, I think is completely untrue. So we should first of all accept that consent is broken and we need to find solutions. The way I see it is we need to find solutions at three levels. One is at the level of businesses, what businesses can do differently. I think Purnima mentioned the whole idea of privacy by design. I think we need to unpack that in very practical ways. What does it really mean? What does it mean in terms of the tech specs? There's a very interesting idea of federated architecture, for example, right? Which means that we don't want to create large centralized databases. We want data to remain where it exists, but we want to enable data exchange to happen subject to some rules, right? So that is one important component of privacy design. But I think there's a lot of thinking to be done on how to make privacy by design something that is practical. So that's on the business side. The second is on the government side and the regulation. And of course, we are all looking forward to the personal data protection bill to become a reality, but then also thinking about regulatory capacity around implementing that, because I think we are opening a huge, we're underestimating at this point what a good execution of the personal data protection bill, etc., that will be required. And I think we need to think of, we've seen from the European example, for instance, that it is a very complex beast. And therefore to think of creative ways of enforcing that while not disadvantaging businesses, especially small businesses, from doing what they do. So that would be the business, would be the government regulation would be the second pillar. And the third, which I think is the most promising pillar, is the consumer pillar. What can we do directly with consumers? And here, one very interesting experiment we tried over the last year, a radio show called Zindagi Mobile, where we tried to work with a radio storyteller who has a lot of following. He has about 3.5 crore listeners, a person called Nilesh Mishra on Big FM. And he created a series of 10 episodes of entertainment stories in which a message around data privacy was embedded. So it wasn't like your public service message of ki data privacy important hai, apna data bacha ke rakho, but more like a story which emphasized the effect of that. And we've done an evaluation actually of that recently, which I'm happy to share with the group later. But it shows very interesting results. This was focused on radio listeners, right? So it's what we call the next 500 million people who are new users to technology and so on and so forth. We are seeing remarkable changes in people's perception of data privacy using creative approaches like that. So I think we need to approach this question at what can businesses do, privacy by design, unpacking that. What can government do once we have the act in place? How do we implement it effectively? And what can we do directly with consumers to change the mindset and making them more empowered to address this issue?
Thanks, Bharat. Anand, you want to come in and probably give your thoughts on this?
Yes, in fact, from the government's perspective, if I want just build onto the pillars that even Bharat mentioned and the questions, I think even before we get into the aspect where we talk about de-identification at an impact evaluation stage because of big data, what the question from the government's perspective even before that when we are designing and implementing programs, on one hand, we have to ensure maximum transparency to ensure better effectiveness. And there we often talk about the most celebrated program of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin, wherein we know that granular data at the level of each and every household is available, tracked through a GIS, through a location, and along with that, four different photographs of 4 different stages of each and every house, which is built in the rural area. Now, that is something which we celebrate a lot, but let's look at the other side, where we have 4 different photographs of individual's households available in the public domain. And how do we actually balance the transparency and delivery of public goods with the upcoming challenge of data privacy? And how do we balance different layering of data access to enable? I think that's the big question that we all have to answer, and the solution towards that is really to sensitize the entire government machinery, the people who are designing the programs right at the initial stage. So we will have to building those nuts and bolts like checklists right at the stage of designing programs of whether this entire design and the data collection in the MIS system is adhering to data privacy norms as and when they get enacted, and then also build benchmarking and compliance indices. So the data governance quality index, which I, for example, talked about, which DMU is working on in terms of building a toolkit around. We have to also evolve data privacy related adherence of compliance in the in those indices so that every particular agency is also adhering to it as we go along. And second, really important big thing is with reference to the third pillar that Bharat talked about, wherein from the perspective of government, the beneficiaries have to really be sensitized of what it really means about privacy, because privacy as a concept in India is something which we have to sensitize our, especially when in a government context where beneficiaries often look at they being recipients of the government's benefits, and hence giving out data for that is a norm for them. So that sensitization through a mass communication module has to be thought through by the government. Those are my two pieces on this.
Thanks, Anand. Sri Ganesh, coming to you, how do you see the trade-offs between transparency versus privacy, especially in the Southeast Asian context? How do you see the needle moving, especially based on your experience?
Sorry, transparency versus
Privacy, data security, how do you see this needle moving?
What do you mean by transparency?
So putting more data onto the online platform, putting Anand's example of putting houses, beneficiary information into the public domain.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think there are sort of other, it's no longer just about, data protection. You now need to also start talking about, cross-border data flows and how that gets affected. That is also part of the discourse, especially when you're looking at a region like ASEAN, for example, right? But I think that the question really about, whether how much do you put access, there are no well-defined answers here, right? Some of the solutions, and you can't think of it as either a technical solution or a legal solution. These are techno-political, legal solutions that need to address this. But I think Bharat has already mentioned some of those when he mentioned sort of federated systems. You can start to think of secure multi-part computation, right? But none of these, then you have to rework that entire system. So the whole from infrastructure that underpins the data ecosystem of the country. So what is the answer? What is it that we would tell people? Stop what you all are doing, right? Re-engineer the entire data architecture, and then maybe take another 10 years and then figure out the development use cases, right? Is that what we are going to tell people? Probably not, right? So how do you sort of go beyond saying be responsible, etc., right? And then for that to happen, we really need to go down to use case level and figure out the mechanisms for them at that point, right? So I mean, it's such a broad topic. I might end up talking for too long. So I'll stop.
Thanks, Sri Ganesh, for those thoughts. So I think we probably have come to the end of the discussion. So I'll start with Bharat for his closing remarks, and then probably move in a reverse order. Bharat, over to you.
Well, I don't have any closing remarks as such, except to say that I think we are at a really important cusp of use of tech for MEL, as this discussion sort of clearly identified. I think it's important, the things that I took away, be very sort of purpose focused, fit for purpose focused. Don't tech is an enabler. Tech is not a solution. So tech has to follow the purpose as opposed to the other way around. I think the issue on embedding this in government and getting the capacity to do this in a sustainable way, which was talked about. And lastly, I think this fledgling area, but where a lot of work is needed on data privacy, security, etc., as the field of data-driven learning and evaluation gets gets further bigger and more scalable. So those were, I think, the big takeaways for me.
Thanks, Bharat. Saik?
Yeah, I just touch upon 2 points. One would be like to echo Sri Ganesh's thoughts in his initial remarks about inclusivity, right? So we need to think about, like, say, public-private partnerships in building all these systems together. And another thing is that you mentioned, like, maybe I don't like the term data poor, but like there is this there could be a north-south global north global south divide that can creep up, right? So I'll give you a quick metric. So from the big data systematic map, I looked at just the impact evaluations, and we saw that about 83% of the researchers working on big data impact evaluations are based in institutions that are in the global north, right? So this again kind of points to the capacity building, public-private partnerships, sort of things, right? And the other point that I would like to touch upon is the transparency and the ethics of doing all of this work, right? So in my work, I deal with a lot of Anand mentioned, like the design phase and everything, where you have to build in all the transparent measures and everything. So this is true for any impact evaluation or any study that we do. But for big data, it is of utmost importance because of the data privacy challenges and the sheer scale of it, right? So we probably need to take a step back, think about where data leakages can happen, where certain ethical reviews need to be done, or more rigorous ethical reviews need to be done, and then move forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Saik. Anand?
So I think most of the points have been covered by the other panelists. There is just one specific element which I would want to look at from the governance perspective here, and which I mentioned earlier as well, that it's extremely critical that this entire idea of embedding emerging approaches and also the technologies, we have to start with the low hanging fruits. And I think that was one of the takeaways, I think, from the discussion. We have to start with what is already available and leverage it the best. That's the first thing that the government needs to do. And then I think secondly, we need to, and to in that particular direction, we will have to, and DMA is already on that pathway, to build the entire necessary cooperative federalism mechanisms to work with the states and the districts to sensitize and build the necessary capacities. And on the other hand, alongside, work to measure how well it is being implemented. So process measurement is something which we'll have to work on, and keeping in mind the broader adherences to the regulatory aspects as well. So I think those are the key takeaways from the discussion. Back to you, Venu.
Thanks, Anand. Purnima ji, for your last set of thoughts.
Yeah, I think I was very interested to hear about SAYAC's study, and that's something I would love to connect with separately. Good to know that there is this kind of assessment of what big data has thrown up, and about the data governance quality index also that Anand was sharing. Two thoughts. One was this, that we did not talk in detail today about transactional data. In the natural course of business, the kind of information that is getting generated, I think there are ways to tap into that also, which, for example, platforms like Digit, which are doing that in the municipal system context, and where you can then define it in those ways so that you're able to get some of that centrally. So I wanted to park that thought. And that some of the points mentioned in the last round about how do we do this, I definitely agree. It's going to be a case of, trying to fly and change the engine at the same time. And some of the interesting examples, which with the smart cities side, where I'm seeing this, construct of having city data officers, a local data custodian whose capacities are built up, who can then, add to the central narrative, because you're going to need stuff happening centrally, and you're going to need to have people within the departments and within the city or the district to be able to, loop into some of this. So I think there are some examples within India where in pockets we are seeing some of this happen, and the opportunity to cross-pollinate that would also be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Purnima. Sri Ganesh, for your last set of thoughts on this topic.
Okay, I think maybe a couple of observations here that as I was listening to this, and I heard all of us say this is important and that is critical, and I'm just wondering, for the viewer who's listening to that, wondering where do I start with, right? Which of these should I tackle first, right? So I think part of my response to that is to say, not, and depending on which sector that one is hailing from, whether it's from government or business, I think starting from the, and I'll riff off something that Varad said, etc. Starting from the use case, what's the problem that I'm trying to solve, right? And then start to figure out from that sense, what is the data that I may need, what is the privacy issues that I may need to consider, what are the ethical issues that I want to consider. Because it is no longer, we are no longer at the stage where we need to go into fishing expeditions around data. There is quite a bit of use cases already for specific problem domains, and we have something to start with. So better to start from the question rather than from the data. The second and my sort of final point here is really that, oh boy, I just sort of had a froze there and I forgot my second point, but I'll just stop there because all of a sudden I just forgot the point that I was going to make. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks, Sri Ganesh. I think that's an important issue that is going to actually re-emphasize is to start with the use case. So with this, we have come to the end of the discussion. So we have a few questions which are unanswered. We'll come back to you probably with the individual replies for those questions. So before we close this session, I want to re-emphasize on a few important emerging themes out of this discussion is to start with the use case, start building fit for purpose models rather than chasing the data, chase the use case so that then build on data and design privacy by design. I think what Purnima and Sayak and I think everyone on the panel has emphasized as an important thing. And I think lastly, the capacity both within the government, across the private sector, and the capacity built through probably through partnerships is one way go ahead for these initiatives to succeed in future. With this, I would probably announce the formal closure of this session, and I would request the audience to join our next session on strengthening pathways from evidence to action. The link for the next session is available on the chat box and the Q&A section, and is also on the DMU website. Please check on dmu.gov.in. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Venu.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Venu. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.